Hello, and welcome to The Sound of Economics from Bruegel, the Brussels-based economics policy think tank. I'm Scott Marcus. I'm a senior fellow here at Bruegel, and today we're here for another installment of the Bruegel Backstage series, which focuses today on the consequences of Brexit, specifically for ICT policy in Europe. Joining me by telephone is Kip Meek. Kip is a former board member of Ofcom, the British regulatory authority for electronic communications, and is also a former chair of the European Regulatory Group, the ERG, which is a group of all the regulators in Europe. It's the forerunner to what today is BEREC. So he's well placed by his experience both in government and also in industry to talk with us. Now, Kip and I were on a panel together about Brexit and ICT's policy at a conference in Trento recently, and we thought that this would be a good opportunity to expand on that discussion and perhaps go into it in a little more depth. So I guess with that said, we can commence. One of the areas that I wanted to touch on first has to deal with the form of Brexit. Historically, there'd been a lot of discussion of Norway. There's been discussion of Switzerland. There's certainly been discussion of Canada as a free trade agreement model. A lot of that discussion is maybe overtaken by events, especially since the publication of the white paper. But we have a complicated situation in the UK, and I was wondering what your thoughts are, Kip. Are we likely to see something based on the white paper? Are we likely to see a crashing out? Are we likely to see something else? Or is it more or less a flip of the coin? Where do you see things heading just now?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that no one knows anything in the UK. In other words, all possibilities seem to be open at the moment, very, very much including the notion of crashing out, which is obviously not something that British citizens, British politicians want, or indeed European citizens. It seems to me that is a real possibility because of the extremely complex political situation in the UK in particular, with neither of the two dominant political parties having any form of agreement or unanimity on what is the appropriate way forward. And so, Mrs. May might well come up with something which appeals to the more moderate wings of the Conservative Party, but the vehement Brexiteers could vote against that, and they may or may not be supported by the Labour Party in that. The degree of confusion is massive politically at the moment, but certainly that notion of the UK crashing out is a possibility. Otherwise, it could be something that is based on what come to be known as the Chequers proposals, which would be a much softer landing in the UK. But equally, even that, there's no detail around that in the sense that it is still a negotiation with Monsieur Barnier and others. And so there's a lot of speculation as to whether the so-called red lines that Mrs. May set out ages ago would be breached or not in the process. And it seems to most informed observers there's a lot of iterations to go in the negotiation with the EU 27. So I'm afraid that doesn't shed much light on what will actually happen, but that is exactly, all of us informed observers are really very unclear as to how things will pan out.
Well, that's very much in line with my perceptions as well. Now, I'm also seeing some increasing noise in the UK about a second referendum. Is there time for a second referendum? Would it likely settle anything that isn't already known?
Well, I think, again, there is a strong sort of centrist demand for a second referendum. It's espoused by the Liberal Democrats who while not a big party in terms of representation in Parliament, nevertheless have a sort of reasonable degree of support in the country, and also again by several strands of thought in both the Labour and the Tory party. But I think it's very difficult to deliver politically. I think one of the things that this sort of whole society wants, I think, is some sort of certainty emerging from all this thing. And I think the notion of extending the period of uncertainty, which a second referendum, I think, will almost inevitably do, would cause problems. And there are lots of details about what would the question be. And I think if you were a politician, you'd be very, very worried about the consequences of having a second referendum, what would happen after it. And so, although I'm very sympathetic to the notion of staying in the European Union, I still think, from a political perspective, it would be difficult for any of the current political parties to sort of align at current big political parties, i.e. the Tories and the Labour Party, to get behind that in a wholehearted way, such that it might happen. So I'm a bit sceptical of that, even though there's a lot of push for it at the moment.
Now, the main reason I raised some of the questions is that, of course, the implications of Brexit for ICT's policy and generally could be very different depending on the kind of exit that the UK takes, assuming that they take an exit. If they were to remain an EEA member, which at the moment seems to me not very likely, not very much would change. But most other scenarios have stronger consequence. Do you see any prospect for EEA membership, or do you also think it's pretty much off the table?
I think it's pretty much off the table. I think I think it will be some if there is an agreement between the UK and the EU 27, I think it will be something separate from that. The telecoms environment, it may not be that different from being an EEA member, in the sense that the UK would be a rule taker, not a rule maker, and could still participate in the institutions in Europe, particularly BEREC and RSPG.
Yeah, well, that was actually something I also wanted to ask you about. Now, the UK has been a tremendous source of expertise. A lot of the 2002 regulatory framework for electronic communications was really shaped by the UK and based on British principles. You've had some very talented folks who contributed to European regulation, you yourself being prominent among them. So the loss of expertise is bad. I think it's not great for the UK either, but at the moment my focus is a little more on the European side. And so the natural question is, what kind of options are there for cooperation? One model, of course, that comes to mind is Switzerland, which has no particular legal rights to participate in BEREC, but nonetheless has an observer status. Not different, really, from the EEA. Any thoughts on that?
Yes. I mean, I think, if you just turn to the individuals concerned within Ofcom and to a lesser extent in government, all of them have both I say all of them, and I think there are actually no exceptions to this. All of them want to remain fully involved in BEREC and RSPG, and involved in the process of European regulation. I think it is generally regarded in the UK as a very successful framework, and what has followed it has been a very successful environment in which the telecoms industry has developed. As you say, I think the UK has been a major contributor to it, likes it. In my recent discussions with government about the nature of telecoms regulation after Brexit, they say that they will, irrespective of whether we crash out or do something more constructive, we will adopt the new EECC, the European Electronic Communications Code, and transpose that into UK law. So there is a big desire to maintain relationships as far as possible, whatever the sort of, supra telecom, the developments that, outside and above telecoms turn out to be.
I would certainly welcome if the UK is able to maintain that kind of role. Now, there are a couple of areas where breakage seems likely to me in any case where the UK is neither an EU member state nor an EEA member. Two that we've talked about before are transfers of personal data and international mobile roaming. I know for my part, the concern I've had with transfers of personal data is that the UK, as a third country, not a member state, would fall through a different paragraph in the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and that a case similar to the Schrems case would be likely, which would probably get in the way of any kind of adequacy decision. It seems to me maybe we're in a whole different game, though, today. Just a few days ago, the ECHR ruled that UK surveillance was excessive, and it seems to me, with that ruling in place, it's difficult for the Commission to grant an adequacy decision. So maybe we don't even get to the case I was expecting. The Schrems decision, of course, invalidated transfers of personal data under the old 2000 safe harbor arrangements, not based on commercial privacy, but based on government surveillance. And so the concern has been right along, my concern has been, that a case similar to Schrems might very well find that UK surveillance was as overbearing as American. And at the moment, we now have a European court ruling that says so. If you poke into your crystal ball, what do you see as likely outcomes for this? I mean, for a lot of UK institutions, this is important. You've got corporate headquarters in the UK that do extensive business on the continent, and vice versa. In both directions, these transfers are important.
I mean, my crystal ball is murky, but I suspect that your underlying hypothesis, which is that there will, the regimes are, will be different in a post-Brexit world, seems to me to be the likely one, and that, as you say, will cause problems. And I think the same type of situation will arise in roaming. I think the balance of traffic issues in roaming and the incentives will mean that the situation will not necessarily be a good one for citizens and consumers in Europe.
This was my thought too. I know in some of the early statements out of the UK government, they seemed to think that they could deal with roaming purely as a domestic matter, and they didn't realize that once the UK exits, the UK can no longer assume that the wholesale payments to European network operators are governed by the roaming regulation or vice versa. So the UK controls the prices but not the costs, and the same is true for the European side. So this seems to me to be worrisome.
Yes, and given that I think it is worrisome, and although all parties may be sensible initially, at some point the incentives on some of the mobile operators will be to do something different, and that again is a bad outcome for consumers. It's quite interesting, and it was regarded in the Commission, the new regime for roaming was regarded as one of the few unequivocally successful interventions by the European Commission on behalf of consumers, and indeed it's difficult to argue with that. This is definitely in peril. But what do you expect when you vote for Brexit? That's the type of thing that you get.
Broken China.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Are there other areas that you can think of that are likely to break? I mean, you were saying that the EECC, the European Electronic Communications Code, will be enacted by the UK as well, or an equivalent set of rules. Which things won't work cross-border?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I've been thinking about is what is the impact of all this on 5G and the deployment of 5G, both in Europe and in the EU 27 and in the UK. I think, as I've said, the UK, whatever happens, will adopt the EECC, and it will come up with policy proposals that are consistent with that. And you can begin to see that emerging in some of the policy thinking with it coming from the UK government. So encouraging things like the neutral host model, the continued support for easing of the rights of way regime to enable, the vast number of additional street furniture to be deployed, money for what the UK government call test beds and trials, the release of additional spectrum, licensing of some spectrum brands. All those things are likely to happen. They're kind of consistent with the EECC, and so I don't think they themselves pose a problem. But I think, in a post-Brexit world, the UK government, I think, will be incentivized to sort of create a sort of 5G ecosystem that is designed to lure investment into the UK. And while we'll have to stick to WTO rules, it may be that the UK's got a bit more sort of discretion about the types of intervention it could make to make 5G successful, and that in turn means that there's potential divergence between the UK regime and the European one. I'm not sure it's that bad an outcome in the end, because I think the European Commission might then be more interested in trying to think of ways of making 5G, basing your 5G-based business in the EU 27 territories, and be more interested in a sort of investment-friendly environment. So, although I think I do think take 5G, take a lot of other areas, I do think in the long term, there will be a divergence rather than a convergence between the UK and the EU 27. I'm not sure it's that disastrous. I think I think there'll be some minuses, but also some pluses that could derive from that. I think the other areas you were talking about previously, i.e., data and roaming, are more likely to be sort of damaging than its impact in other arenas.
That makes sense to me too. That's largely the way I read it. Why don't we talk for a bit about the impact on the sector and such? The UK is a huge hotbed of entrepreneurship and innovation. If we compare startup activity in London to Paris, Amsterdam, Berlin, clearly the UK is a huge European center. From the EU side, that seems kind of unfortunate. Do you see prospects for maintaining synergies there, or is that simply something where there's probably some cost to the UK as well, also in terms of your ability to attract skilled workers from the continent?
Look, I live in London, and I walk in Regent's Park. It's just over the road from where I live. And Regent's Park, the accents that you hear are German, French, Hungarian, Polish, Indian, Middle Eastern. As you say, the UK has, in the past few years, attracted. I very much hope that the entrepreneurship, the innovation that currently characterizes some parts of the UK will persist. But if London, for example, becomes off limits to an enterprising French person or an enterprising German person or Italian person or whatever, and they have to go elsewhere to start their business, then the EU27 will be the big beneficiary of it, and of course we will lose. So as a sort of personal mission shared by me and other influential people in the UK, of course we want to maintain the open and liberal environment and society that we have at the moment, and we're very worried about controls on free movement of people. We think that's a very negative thing. But of course, unfortunately, that is likely to be a consequence, and it will have economic damage as a result.
Yes, it's not just about the National Health Service, which will also have problems recruiting skilled personnel.
Absolutely. The National Health Service will struggle, but so will a lot of innovative, exciting new businesses, which, of course, help to fund the National Health Service.
Okay, now, in some other areas, there are areas where the UK has been a real engine of innovation. I'm thinking especially of areas like artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. So there's clearly risk of cooperation between EU27 and UK institutions being impacted, but there's also possible solutions. We do, for example, have arrangements for Horizon 2020 membership that could be done by treaty, even with countries that are neither EU nor EEA members. The most obvious example being Israel. Mm. So with goodwill, that could continue. I think the UK wants that. What do you see as prospects for that?
Yeah, I think after this terrible period, and assuming we actually go forward to Brexit, and it does actually happen, I would fervently hope, and I think actually I do believe that good sense will break out, and that a lot of bilateral arrangement between the UK and the EU27 will then develop, and we will painstakingly and with difficulty attempt to recreate some of the things that happened previously automatically and without difficulty. I think academic collaboration in fields like AI, I hope will be an example of that. It'll all be a little sticky, a little more difficult than it was previously, but people will want that to happen in the UK and hopefully within the EU27.
Well, it's certainly something that I've pushed for in my work for the Parliament, and it's something that I hope that most people here would wish for. Certainly people that work in these fields would very much welcome it. So at this point, we've covered most of the things that I wanted to cover. Have we missed anything that you wanted to say?
I don't think so, Scott. I've always been very interested in the evolution of European institutions like BEREC and RSPG. It relates to my history as you described it earlier on. I very much hope that they provide a interesting sort of mechanism that both holds national regulators to account and also holds the Commission to account on occasion. Leaving the European Union won't in any way derail the development of those two institutions in particular.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you very much, Kip, for these very thoughtful and helpful comments. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening to Bruegel Backstage on the Sound of Economics channel, and many, many thanks to our guest, Kip Meek. If you're interested in more of Bruegel's work, we have an array of blog posts and publications available on our website, www.bruegel.org, and I hope that you'll join us again. Until next time, farewell.